In the dark, freezing winter of 1940, London was burning. Not metaphorically, literally. Searchlights clawed at the night sky. Incendiaries punched through rooftops. Entire streets disappeared in minutes. The Battle of Britain had been won in the air, but the war had only just begun on the ground. And beneath the rubble, beneath the defiance, beneath the speeches broadcast to the world, there was a secret the British government could not allow the public to know. The British Empire was running out of money. On maps, it still looked invincible. A quarter of the planet shaded pink, colonies on every continent, trade routes that wrapped around the globe. But inside the underground cabinet war rooms in Whitehall, the men running the war knew the truth. Britain was not just bleeding soldiers. It was bleeding cash. And in a modern war, cash was as lethal as bullets. Winston Churchill understood this before almost anyone else. He was a man built for moments of existential crisis. His words could harden resolve, turn fear into defiance, and convince a nation to endure almost anything. But words could not buy oil. They could not buy steel. And they could not buy time. So in December of 1940, Churchill sat at his desk and wrote one of the most consequential letters in modern history. It was addressed to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States. The letter was polite. It was strategic. It spoke of shared values and the threat of tyranny. But buried inside it was an admission so humiliating it bordered on unthinkable. Britain was broke. The country that had financed wars for centuries, the empire that had once been the world's banker, could no longer pay cash for the weapons it needed to survive. The treasury was nearing empty. The gold was vanishing, and the clock was ticking. This was not supposed to happen. When the war began in September of 1939, Britain still believed it could finance victory the way it always had. The empire possessed enormous reserves of gold. British investors owned railways in South America, mines in Africa, factories in North America. The city of London was still one of the great financial centers of the world, but this war was different. Total war did not just consume men. It consumed machines, aircraft, tanks, ships, ammunition, fuel, aluminum, rubber, vast quantities of everything, every single day. And Britain, an island nation, had to import almost all of it. When Germany overran Europe, Britain lost access to nearby markets overnight. The continent was sealed off. The only remaining lifeline stretched 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean. And at the other end of that lifeline stood the United States. Officially, America was neutral. Politically, it was hostile to foreign entanglements. The memory of the First World War still hung heavy over American voters. Congress had no interest in dragging the country into another European catastrophe. And so lawmakers had built a legal wall to keep the war at arm's length. It was called cash and carry. Under the neutrality laws, Britain could buy American weapons, planes, food, and fuel. But there would be no credit, no loans, no delayed payments. Everything had to be paid for immediately, in cash, and it had to be transported on British ships. For the United States, it was perfect. American factories stayed busy. American workers stayed employed. And America took zero financial risk. Gold first, goods second. For Britain, it was a slow-motion financial execution. Month after month, the British Treasury wired dollars to American suppliers. Gold reserves were shipped out under heavy guard in a secret operation so sensitive it was barely recorded on paper. Billions in bullion crossed the Atlantic, disappearing into vaults in Canada and the United States. It was the largest movement of physical wealth in human history. By the end of 1940, the vaults were empty. The British Purchasing Commission in Washington began receiving instructions they had never received before. Contracts could not be signed. Orders had to be delayed. The money simply was not there. Britain could fight. Britain could endure bombing. But Britain could not manufacture dollars. That was the moment Churchill's letter landed on Roosevelt's desk. And when Roosevelt read it, he understood something most people still misunderstand today. If Britain fell, the war would not end in Europe. It would come to America next. Roosevelt was not blind to the danger. He could see that Britain was fighting the war that America was desperately trying to avoid. But understanding the problem and solving it were two very different things. The United States was still officially neutral, and American law was explicit. The government was forbidden from giving money or weapons to a foreign power at war. Any open bailout of Britain would have triggered a political explosion at home. Roosevelt needed a solution that looked responsible, even generous, while still protecting American interests. He needed to help Britain survive without appearing to subsidize a failing empire. And most importantly, he needed to sell that solution to Congress and the American public. That solution became known as Lend-Lease. In public, Roosevelt explained it with a simple, almost homespun analogy. If your neighbor's house is on fire, he said, you do not sell him a garden hose. You lend it to him, and he gives it back when the fire's out. It sounded humane. It sounded reasonable. It sounded temporary. But behind the scenes, Lend-Lease was not a friendly exchange between neighbors. It was a financial reckoning between a creditor and a debtor who had run out of options. The man tasked with enforcing that reckoning was Henry Morgenthau, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury. Morgenthau despised fascism and wanted Britain to defeat Hitler. But his primary loyalty was to the American taxpayer, and his position was brutally simple. Before the United States provided a single dollar of aid, Britain had to prove that it had already sacrificed everything it could possibly sacrifice. Morgenthau demanded an audit, not a symbolic review, a full accounting of the British Empire's global assets. He wanted to know what the British government owned, what British companies owned, and what British citizens owned anywhere in the world. He wanted balance sheets, valuations, revenue streams. He wanted proof that Britain was not hiding wealth while asking America to foot the bill. For the British negotiators, this was shocking. They had not come to Washington as a failed business seeking bankruptcy protection. They had come as an ally fighting for survival, but they were treated as neither equal nor partner. They were treated as a distressed entity under investigation. Sir Frederick Phillips, leading the British financial delegation, tried to argue their case. He explained that Britain had already liquidated its gold, that selling long-term investments during wartime would be a fire sale, that stripping overseas income would leave the country economically crippled after the war, unable to rebuild or even feed itself. Morgenthau was unmoved. If Britain still owned profitable assets in the United States, he argued, why should American farmers and factory workers pay higher taxes to support the war? Why should an American family fund British survival, while British capital still earned dividends on American soil? It was cold logic, and it was irresistible. One asset, in particular, caught Morgenthau's attention. A company so profitable, so strategically valuable, that it became a test case for how far the United States was willing to go. The company was American Viscose. American Viscose was the largest producer of rayon and synthetic fibers in the United States. It was a cornerstone of American industry, generating millions in profit every year. And it was owned by a British parent company. For Britain, it was a jewel, a steady stream of dollars flowing back across the Atlantic, helping to balance the trade deficit and keep the empire solvent. Morgenthau saw it differently. He informed the British delegation that American Viscose would have to be sold. The proceeds would be deposited directly into the U.S. Treasury and used to pay for existing arms contracts. There would be no exceptions. The British resisted. They knew the company was worth far more than what it would fetch in a forced sale. They warned that selling under pressure would be financial suicide. But Morgenthau held the leverage. The Lend-Lease bill was moving through Congress. Isolationists were attacking it, claiming Britain was wealthy and deceptive. Morgenthau needed proof of British suffering, and American Viscose became the sacrifice. The sale of American Viscose was carried out with ruthless efficiency. There was no time for careful valuation, no room for negotiation. Everyone involved knew the British government had no choice, and in finance, desperation is always punished. The company was seized under emergency wartime powers and handed to American investment bankers to be sold as quickly as possible. Because the sale was forced, buyers circled like predators. They knew Britain needed cash immediately. They knew there would be no second round, no counteroffer, no delay. American Viscose was worth well over $100 million. It was a cash machine. But when the deal closed, the British received barely half that amount. Tens of millions of dollars in value vanished overnight. The dollars from the sale went straight into the U.S. Treasury to pay for aircraft engines, rifles, and ammunition. Meanwhile, the British government had to reimburse the original owners back home in pounds, adding yet another layer of debt to an already collapsing balance sheet. This was the moment the British elite finally understood the reality of their position. They were not partners. They were not equals. They were a distressed client being liquidated. And American Viscose was only the beginning. While accountants fought over factories and balance sheets, another negotiation was unfolding that would reshape the global balance of power far beyond spreadsheets. Britain was desperate for naval protection. German U-boats were tearing through Atlantic shipping lanes faster than British shipyards could replace the losses. Food, fuel, and raw materials were sinking to the bottom of the ocean. Churchill pleaded with Roosevelt for destroyers, 50 of them, old ships from the First World War, rusting in American naval yards, obsolete by modern standards, and of little use to the U.S. Navy. Roosevelt agreed. But again, nothing was free. In exchange for 50 aging destroyers, the United States demanded 99-year leases on a chain of British military bases stretching across the Atlantic world. Newfoundland, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Trinidad, British Guiana, strategic outposts that controlled sea lanes, air routes, and the Western Hemisphere itself. Britain handed over the keys. It was an astonishing trade, 50 outdated ships in exchange for a century of American military presence on British sovereign territory. The deal was framed as cooperation. In reality, it was a fire sale of strategic influence. Britain was trading permanent geopolitical assets for temporary survival. By early 1941, the pattern was unmistakable. Britain was not just paying for weapons. It was paying with its future. When Lend-Lease was finally formalized, it was celebrated publicly as an act of generosity. The United States would become the arsenal of democracy. Supplies would flow. Britain would live. But buried deep inside the legal language was a clause that would quietly dismantle the economic foundations of the empire. Article 7. Article 7 required Britain to abandon its system of imperial preference after the war. That system was the glue holding the empire together. Colonies and dominions traded with Britain on favorable terms, protected by tariffs that kept foreign competition out. It ensured British factories always had guaranteed markets. By agreeing to Article 7, Britain agreed to tear that system down. British negotiators fought desperately against it. They warned that opening imperial markets to American goods would destroy British industry once the war ended. They argued that it would reduce the empire to a collection of independent consumers buying American products. They were right, but the Luftwaffe was still bombing London. The U-boats were still in the Atlantic. The treasury was empty. And so Britain signed. It was not surrender on the battlefield. It was surrender on paper. Once the United States formally entered the war, the relationship changed in tone but not in direction. American troops poured into Britain. Airfields expanded. Ports overflowed with equipment. The island became a vast forward operating base for a war that was now truly global. On the surface, it looked like partnership. Underneath, the economic imbalance only widened. American industry exploded. Shielded from bombing and fueled by massive government spending, U.S. factories grew larger, faster, and more efficient every year. They produced tanks and bombers for the war, but they also continued producing consumer goods for the world beyond it. Refrigerators, radios, automobiles, machinery. While Britain converted nearly its entire industrial base to military production, America kept one foot firmly in the future. British exports collapsed. Markets in Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East were abandoned out of necessity. Someone else stepped in to supply them. American companies. By the time the war began turning in the Allies' favor, the commercial map of the world had already been redrawn. By 1944, the shift was undeniable. Gold that had once flowed through London now sat in American vaults. The dollar replaced the pound as the world's reference currency. Financial gravity had crossed the Atlantic. Still, Britain believed the sacrifice would be recognized. The British government assumed that once the war ended, Lend-Lease would continue for a short transition period. They believed the United States would allow Britain time to retool its economy, rebuild its cities, and restart exports. They believed there would be a soft landing. They were wrong. On the 15th of August, 1945, Japan surrendered. The war was over. In Britain, the streets filled with celebration. People danced. Strangers embraced. After 6 years of sacrifice, the nightmare had finally ended. 7 days later, the bill arrived. Without warning, President Harry Truman ordered the immediate termination of Lend-Lease. There was no phase-out, no grace period, no negotiation. Aid stopped instantly. American ships already loaded with food and supplies were ordered to turn around in the middle of the Atlantic and sail home. The shock was paralyzing. Britain's economy had been completely reshaped to function on Lend-Lease dollars. The country imported nearly half its food and most of its raw materials. Without American financing, Britain was bankrupt overnight. Not in theory, not eventually, immediately. John Maynard Keynes, the most influential economist of his generation, examined the numbers and saw disaster. He warned the government that Britain faced a financial Dunkirk. Without immediate assistance, the country would be unable to pay for food imports. Rations would fall below survival levels. Factories would shut down. Unemployment would surge. Social collapse was a real possibility. There was only one option left. Britain had to beg. In September 1945, a sick and exhausted Keynes boarded a ship bound for Washington. He was suffering from severe heart disease. He knew the journey might kill him, but he also knew that without American help, Britain would starve. Keynes did not go asking for charity. He went asking for justice. He planned to argue that Britain had fought alone against Hitler for 2 years while America remained neutral, that Britain had sacrificed its empire to hold the line, and that the United States owed Britain a grant, not a loan, as payment for saving Western civilization. When he arrived, he discovered that justice was not a currency the Americans were willing to accept. The reception in Washington was cold. The war was over and sentiment had shifted. American voters were exhausted by Europe. Congress had no appetite for generosity, especially toward a British government that had just elected a Labour administration promising nationalization and socialist reforms. To many lawmakers, Britain was no longer a heroic ally. It was a financial risk. The American negotiators were blunt. There would be no grant. There would be no gift. There would only be a loan. The offer was $3.75 billion. It sounded enormous, but it was barely enough to keep Britain solvent. Worse, it came with conditions designed not merely to help Britain recover, but to permanently dismantle what remained of its economic independence. The most dangerous condition was sterling convertibility. Under the terms of the loan, Britain was required to make the pound fully convertible into dollars within 1 year. Anyone, anywhere in the world holding pounds would be allowed to exchange them freely for U.S. currency. On paper, this was described as free trade. In reality, it was a trap. During the war, Britain had forced its colonies and trading partners to accept payment in pounds while blocking conversion into dollars. This created a closed system known as the sterling area. Countries like India, Australia, and Egypt accumulated vast reserves of British currency, but had no choice except to spend it on British goods. It protected British industry and kept factories alive. Convertibility would destroy that system overnight. Keynes understood the danger instantly. He warned that once the pound was opened, every holder of sterling would rush to convert it into dollars. American goods were better, cheaper, and more abundant. The demand for dollars would be overwhelming. Britain's reserves would vanish in weeks. He fought the clause relentlessly. He warned that it would drain the loan for nothing, leaving Britain weaker than before. But the alternative was starvation. Reluctantly, the British government accepted the terms. Parliament approved the loan in July 1946. Keynes returned home broken. He died a few months later, his heart finally giving out. The consequences arrived exactly as he had predicted. On the 15th of July, 1947, Britain made the pound convertible. The response was immediate and violent. Governments, banks, and traders around the world rushed to dump sterling. Dollars poured out of Britain's reserves. In just a few weeks, hundreds of millions were gone. The hemorrhage was so severe that officials watched in disbelief as the loan evaporated before their eyes. After only 5 weeks, Britain was forced to suspend convertibility. The window was slammed shut. The experiment had failed catastrophically. The humiliation was total. Britain had tried to play by American rules, and it had been crushed. The economic damage rippled outward. With reserves drained, Britain could no longer sustain its global commitments. In February 1947, the government sent a confidential message to Washington. Britain could no longer afford to support Greece and Turkey against communist pressure. The treasury was empty. The responsibility was being transferred. That telegram triggered the Truman Doctrine. The United States stepped in, not as a partner, but as the new guarantor of global order. It was the moment Britain quietly surrendered its role as a superpower. The decline did not stop with diplomacy. It settled into daily life. In 1949, with reserves still fragile and exports weak, the British government devalued the pound. Before the war, £1 bought $4.86. After devaluation, it bought $2.80. Overnight, the British people became dramatically poorer in global terms. Imports cost more. Living standards fell. The empire that had once set the price of money now watched its currency bend to American reality. But the final cost of the war was not paid in the 1940s. It stretched across generations. The Anglo-American loan was not symbolic. It was commercial. Every year, for decades, the British Treasury transferred money to Washington. Governments changed, empires dissolved, but the payments continued. Through post-war rebuilding, through economic crises, through booms and recessions, Britain kept paying for the privilege of having survived. The final payment was made in December of 2006, more than 60 years after the war ended. By then, the empire was long gone. The colonies had slipped away one by one, not conquered, but unaffordable. The financial foundations that had once made global control possible no longer existed. Britain still mattered. It still had influence, but it no longer shaped the world. That role had passed to the United States. The irony is difficult to escape. Britain had fought the war to stop a tyrant from dominating Europe. It succeeded. But in doing so, it bankrupted itself and accelerated the rise of a new global order. The United States emerged from the conflict richer, stronger, and structurally dominant. Its factories were intact. Its currency was supreme. Its military bases ringed the globe. The British Empire was not destroyed by invasion. It was dismantled by contracts, clauses, and balance sheets. When Churchill wrote that letter in 1940, he saved his country from immediate defeat. There was no other choice. Survival demanded sacrifice. But the price was the future. Britain spent its past to secure the present, and in doing so, sold the world it had built. This is the hidden bill of World War II, a war Britain won with courage, paid for with empire, and finished still writing checks long after the guns fell silent.